Mrs. Newell, please call the roll.
Mrs. Carl.
Here.
Mr. Hillier.
Here.
Mr. Fair.
Here.
Mrs. Siebolt.
Here.
Mr. Barone.
Here.
Mrs. Vale.
Here.
Mr. Francis.
Here.
I don't see Reverend Spalding here this evening, so the invocation will be given by Mr. Francis. And please rise and remain standing for the pledge.
Let's bow if you desire to. Holy Father, we come to you and just ask for your guidance. We ask, Lord God, that the government of this city would reach out for wisdom from you. Let everything that we do be respectful. Be respectful for the citizens and respectful to one another. So we ask for your guidance and ledger upon everything that we do. In Christ's holy name, amen.
Amen.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you, Mr. Francis. Council, before you are the minutes of previous meetings and any additions or corrections. Now I'll ask for a motion.
So move.
I'll second it.
Been moved and seconded for the acceptance of the minutes of the previous meetings. All in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, nay. They are approved. Mrs. Newell, any petitions or communications?
Nope.
Council, any committee reports? And I see no liquor control licenses, no proclamations, and I have no forms for people speaking on matters not covered by legislation, so we're ready to move on to the legislative portion of the meeting. Council, before you are the, we did have one change, just one small addition to one of the resolutions. Other than that, or any other changes? Otherwise, I'll assume they're approved by consensus. Mrs. Newell, tonight we would like to have you read these by title and number only, and we're going to start with resolution for third reading, Resolution 2014-40.
Resolution number 2014-40, a resolution authorizing and directing the Safety Service Director to record highway easements for the northeast and northwest corners of the intersection of West Chestnut and North Sandusky Streets.
Mr. Fair.
Thank you, Mr. President. I'd like to ask for the adoption of Resolution 2014-40.
Second.
Been moved and seconded for the adoption of this resolution. Any discussion? Mr. Fair.
Well, we've talked about this, and I think it's pretty well cut and dried. Are there any questions from anyone on council?
If not, Mrs. Newell.
Mrs. Carl.
Yes.
Mr. Hillier.
Yes.
Mr. Fair.
Yes.
Mrs. Siebolt.
Yes.
Mr. Barone.
Yes.
Mrs. Vale.
Yes.
Mr. Francis.
Yes.
The resolution is adopted. There are no resolutions for second reading. There are some for first reading. The first one is Resolution 2014-48. Mrs. Newell.
Resolution number 2014-48, a resolution to submit application for FY 2014 Community Development Block Grant Downtown Revitalization Grant and declaring an emergency.
Mr. Hillier.
Thank you, Mr. President. I move to suspend the rule for 3 separate readings. Take Resolution 2014-48 to its third and final reading, please.
I'll second.
Been moved and seconded for the suspension of the rules. Any discussion on the suspension?
If I could, please. Council, like I mentioned in the committee meeting, this grant is due by June 20th. We don't meet until around that or after that period of time. The committee that is working on this has had a very short time to prepare it. This is why we're asked to pass it in emergency legislation.
Thank you. Any other discussion on the suspension? Mrs. Newell.
Mrs. Carl.
Yes.
Mr. Hillier.
Yes.
Mr. Fair.
Yes.
Mrs. Siebolt.
Yes.
Mr. Barone.
Yes.
Mrs. Vale.
Yes.
Mr. Francis.
Yes.
The rule is suspended. Mr. Hillier.
Thank you. Move to adopt Resolution 2014-48, please.
I'll second.
Been moved and seconded for the adoption of this resolution. Any discussion? Mr. Hillier.
Council, this is the CDBG grant we talked about earlier for $300,000. That's what they're applying for. I'm going to refer to Mr. Scott. I see he came to the podium. Must be for a reason.
Mr. Hillier, I heard in your committee meeting you had earlier that there'd be no cost to the city for this. Is that correct?
That's what I was told.
The infrastructure listed here says there'll be sidewalks, curbs, pedestrian ramps, and crosswalks. Will the grant then cover the entire project in relationship to these infrastructures?
I'll let Mr. Glass answer that.
As I understand it, sir, it does.
We've had 3 of these in prior years, all of them the time I have been here. We did an extensive grant like this in the South Main Street area, of which these same types of improvements were done. And the city put a significant amount of money into that work and that improvements. Are we talking about the same type of what took place on South Main Street that will be taking place?
Well, what I'm going to do is refer you to Mr. Glass, because that's the conversation where I got my conversation from.
I'm just wondering whether council fully understands that there might be some expense coming up here in this project, if that be the case. I mean, I'm not opposed to what we're doing here for the grant program, but I just want to make sure that if in fact that there is cost involved, that you guys are aware that there will be some capital improvement monies that might have to go into this project. And how
Mr.
much
Scott,
are-
in our committee meeting where we discussed this, there was reference made to a second grant, a supplemental grant. Is that part of the funding package that brings the whole thing up to 500 and some thousand?
Well, that could be. First of all, this thing has moved quickly, and there were meetings held, and there was a consultant brought in to do a plan because, see, Kerry left, but it requires a plan that actually spells out what you're going to be doing. Curbs, crosswalks, gutters, whatever. And in that, you have to have cost estimates. Well, we had a consultant come in, and he wanted $80,000 to do that project. Well, nobody on our little committee thought that was reasonable. So Cameron is here. Cameron's been in on this too. We actually have, for the benefit of council, have we selected someone to do a plan that will be of less cost?
Yes,
And who is that?
me.
So Mr. Keaton, our city engineer, is going to do that for less cost. And Cameron, I'm right. Cameron, I am right that in this little project you're going to put together, and I realize there's no little project, but in that you will determine some costs of the project.
Yes, and that's all been done.
And is that available, that, what cost, and
We finished it on Friday of last week. I've yet to review it, look at it, but I can tell you that the cost that we put together is about $450,000. It does include sidewalks, curbing, handicap ramps, those types of things.
And to soften that a little bit, we have, as you all know, we have $75,000 that comes to us in a formula programs, which we can use as a city participation in this. But this is our 4th effort in downtown revitalization. And Terry's absolutely right. The one we did where we did the streetscape in South Main Street was very costly to the city of Mount Vernon. And there were grant, and they did that's when we went to the 50-50 rather than 60-40. We did those things, and they seemed to work, so that's why we're at 50-50 now. It will work, but at the same time, the city will be expected, and that's, Cameron, I appreciate you. Since I wasn't here, I wasn't privy to the plan, but that plan you have includes the money that the city will put in for the amount of, what, $450,000?
I don't think the city's going to put that in. That's all grant dollars.
Okay, but,
Going towards the grant.
and grant money can be spent?
My understanding, yes.
Okay.
Finish that sentence.
I also put a cost together for the intersection of Sandusky and High, or Sandusky and High. That's a project that we anticipate doing in the next 2 to 3 years, and I think that, as Kerry mentioned, maybe you didn't catch it, you can claim that as match money towards this project.
But actually, as far as the grant speaks, that money's not going towards this grant.
Did I hear Carrie right when she said that there would be a grant to individual property owners and they would make up the difference? That's what I heard. Did I not hear that
Yeah,
correctly?
Yeah.
they'd pay
On
half.
the individual house or individual business rehabilitations, those are 50-50 grants. If somebody's gonna do a roof and a facade and they're gonna spend $20,000, they can get 10, and they have to pay 10.
And we had to, I'm going to muddy it even further, the 10 steps for somebody to revitalize their property. They have to, if they're going to do something to the front of the building, they have to address those 10 steps in order to receive the half of the funding, correct?
Yes.
And if somebody doesn't stay within that grant and wants to do a project, they don't have to follow those steps, such as what's going on High Street right now. Mayor?
Well, I think one of the things that, Mike, you addressed, and then Kerry did, that if somebody has a $45,000 project, then we have set the maximum as being 15,000. They can do that project
Yes.
and get the 15,000 as a participation in that project. But some projects, it may only be $10,000, and they get 5 from us. But, and Cameron, that's why I'm a little confused, and I apologize, and I wasn't here to ask these questions earlier, but if Kerry said they had 15 projects down there identified, these would be businesses that were going to, that presumably would apply for some sort of a project. So if your money included, I don't know, I don't expect you to recall this totally, but do you recall the money that you feel will be put into the infrastructure, and then the money that will be left in order to participate with these 15 or so, and there may be more of those?
I think it's 2 different pots of money, maybe Mr. Glass.
The number that we've thrown around in those meetings, and I know you were gone for a week, was $150,000, 10 business projects at $15,000 apiece. It was just a ballpark. They don't know who's going to respond to those. I mean, you've been involved.
Well, she
in
said
it.
there was 15 people at a meeting tonight down at the Alcove before she came here.
When you have
With
15, if
interest.
you can get 10
With
that want to
interest.
spend money, you're lucky, you know, so.
Yeah.
But that was where these numbers came from. And the $400,000 was infrastructure work, so. That's the 550, the 300 you're applying for, and the 250 they got granted.
Well, I follow everything you're saying here, but if you're only gonna have 400 for infrastructure, please give me your number again for.
I think we're about 450.
So where would the other 50, I'm just use these as numbers and assume they played
Again,
themselves
these are
out.
ballparks that were done in a couple days. If we if we receive the grant, you tone it down to whatever size you want it to be. You know, if you have to eliminate one crosswalk or one piece of curb to get it back down to
This is by no
405.
means what I did is not final engineering. This is putting enough together that I could put a comfortable cost estimate together to submit for a grant.
I just want council to be aware of what potentials you might see here in the future as this all comes together, if in fact they come back and want some additional dollars for us to contribute to it, so.
As it is right now, though, Mr. Scott, we are not identifying any money coming out of the city's general fund, correct?
I don't know
With
anything
the- I
about
mean,
this
that's the-
project.
that's
I've
the
never been
answer to
my
involved in
understanding,
any
yes.
conversation.
I will ask Mr. Keaton that, I think the mayor said it but didn't finish the question. So your engineering cost is part of this grant, is that what, or,
No,
No,
Okay.
he's just,
Hang
that's
on.
part of his salary.
that would
'Cause I-
have been an additional cost above.
I understand that. But it is coming out of your office, so I don't know what question the mayor didn't finish.
Well, no, my point was that we originally started with an $80,000 project that would have determined specific costs for all of this. And, you know, they've changed the rules on this. I don't want to pretend that what we did, 8 or 9 years ago is applicable today. But generally speaking, downtown revitalization does not cover 100% of the project. So if the $250,000 that you have in a separate grant could be construed as city contribution, then that probably answers the question.
And I'm comfortable to pass this as it is right now, knowing that if there's any money that comes out of the city's funds, it's gonna have to come back to council, correct?
It would have, and if you need more than the 250, I didn't see anything in the budget that not that we identify everything in January for the budget for the year, but I don't think, this thing was, as everybody has pointed out, this was a kind of a quick startup. So no one's really had the time to spend on this that we'd like. And if Cameron hadn't stepped in and say, I'll put this plan together for you, we probably wouldn't be this far with it, so.
So if we had exposure, we'd probably be somewhere into the 2015, 2016, I'm assuming. She said it would be this fall before they would
Right.
get
September, I think,
notice.
before you've got an answer.
Right.
Well,
Well-
Mrs. Scott, I appreciate your concern.
Yeah,
about
it's just something.
the levity of
This
this.
council needs to be aware
Yes,
that, you know,
I
there's
appreciate
a
that very
possibility
much.
that, as the mayor has indicated, the 3 that we've had prior to this did not come without contributions
And
from the city.
We have went for grants before, knowing the possibility that there may or may not be matching funds to the amount they wanted. So I am comfortable to pass this.
I'm comfortable as well because I think what I've heard, and I think the question I asked earlier in the evening, indeed, there is a matching component to grants of this nature, but it sounds like we've identified that match in terms of other grant money that we have. So we're not talking about coming to council necessarily to ask for a new appropriation of funds. It's identified as part of other grant monies? Do I
I think
have
that's what
a?
we're saying here tonight. that,
Yeah,
I remember the downtown revitalization cost the city $400,000 on that down South Main Street there. And we had to come up with that. But when you ask people on the street, they say, well, that was grant. Well, a lot of it was grant, but the city had to put a lot of money into it.
Right.
And when we did the first project over here on West High, that first block, in front of Flappers there and the next businesses there, they found underground utilities there that had to be all rebuilt. And that was money we did not have planned for. So, you know, when you do a project like this, you generally find projects you didn't know you were going to do. But I think the $250,000 probably will address the what we would call local share.
yep.
Thank you, Mr. Scott. I appreciate your input there, Mayor.
Any other discussion? Mrs. Knoll?
Mrs. Carl?
Yes.
Mr. Hillier?
Yes.
Mr. Fair?
Yes.
Mrs. Siebel?
Yes.
Mr. Barone?
Yes.
Mrs. Vale?
Yes.
Mr. Francis?
Yes.
Resolution is adopted.
Thank you.
Next resolution is Resolution 2014-49. Mrs. Knoll?
Resolution number 2014-49. A resolution authorizing the Safety Service Director to advertise for bids and enter into contract for the reconstruction of bridges on North Catherine Street and Syker Road and declaring an emergency.
Mr. Fair?
Thank you, Mr. President. I'd like to ask for a suspension of the rules for 2014-49, so taking to third and final reading, please.
Second.
Moved and seconded for the suspension of the rules. Any discussion on the suspension? Mrs. Knoll?
Mrs. Carl?
Yes.
Mr. Hillier?
Yes.
Mr. Fair?
Yes.
Mrs. Siebel?
Yes.
Mr. Barone?
Yes.
Mrs. Vale?
Yes.
Mr. Francis?
Yes.
The rule is suspended. Mr. Fair?
Asking for passage of resolution number 2014-49, please.
Second.
Been moved and seconded for the adoption of this resolution. Any discussion? Mr. Fair?
We've kind of discussed this back and forth. Are any questions from council on this particular issue? Sir?
Mr. Fair, could I just ask for the benefit of those who weren't able to tune in, that we maybe provide just a little detail on where these bridges are and when they're going to be, and maybe,
These bridges are, if I'm not mistaken, it's kind of interesting because they're the old style bridges that we used to have. They're kind of the concrete bridges, and they are off to the, I would say, north, east perhaps, of Pleasant Street. And so if you look back in the records, you would find that these bridges are probably historical.
yeah.
But they do need, because you can see that it's been chipped away at over the years.
One is on Catherine Street and the other is on Syker Road.
Correct.
Any other discussion?
Well, just so people know, this is also the recipient of a CDBG grant, correct?
Yeah.
Did you want to?
And you appropriated the remainder of the money we needed in the.
But that's where some of the grant money goes on that particular one.
Anybody else would like any clarification or comments? Mr. President?
Mrs. Knoll?
Mrs. Carl?
Yes.
Mr. Hillier?
Yes.
Mr. Fair?
Yes.
Mrs. Siebel?
Yes.
Mr. Barone?
Yes.
Mrs. Vale?
Yes.
Mr. Francis?
Yes.
Resolution is adopted. Next resolution is Resolution 2014-50. Mrs. Knoll?
Resolution number 2014-50. A resolution authorizing the Safety Service Director to advertise for bids and enter into contract for the 2014 annual street resurfacing project and declaring an emergency.
Mr. Fair?
Thank you, Mr. President. I'd like to ask for suspension of the rules, require 3 separate readings, so Resolution 2014-50 could be taken to its third and final reading.
Second.
Moved and seconded for the suspension of the rules. Any discussion on the suspension? Mrs. Knoll?
Mrs. Carl?
Yes.
Mr. Hillier?
Yes.
Mr. Fair?
Yes.
Mrs. Siebel?
Yes.
Mr. Barone?
Yes.
Mrs. Vale?
Yes.
Mr. Francis?
Yes.
The rule is suspended. Mr. Fair?
I'd like to ask for the passage of Resolution 2014-50.
Second.
Moved and seconded for the adoption of this resolution. Any discussion? Mr. Fair?
We also have talked about this, and Mr. Glass and I have had a conversation concerning this, and each year we spend an awful lot of money on resurfacing. Sidebar, we don't resurface bricks. But anyway, tongue-in-cheek. So anyway, we're spending a fair sum of money, to repair the streets. The council has all been given the different streets that are being classified for to be redone. And I'll ask if there are any questions, if anyone.
Well, but Mr. Fair, in our discussion earlier with Mr. Keating, we determined that this list was not really finalized, that there are going to be some reviews and maybe reconsiderations because we were somewhat concerned about being attentive to streets where there is higher traffic volume. So Mr. Cameron Keating, I always want to call you Mr. Cameron, I'm sorry, has assured us that he will be taking another look at this. So what we're passing this evening is simply to authorize the administration to move forward as necessary on this.
Yes, 4 bids and enter into a contract, so, I understand that. Any other questions?
If I could, and I did bring up about West High Street, is it possible to look at? I do see on here, we are doing Maplewood to West High Street, so the equipment would already be there, so they would not be in a big hefty charge of moving equipment to that end of town, so I can, and I do appreciate the fact we're gonna relook at this, because I do think there are a few that may can wait or have other plans. But, John, you did mention brick streets, and I have a question, since we are talking resurfacing. We have a couple, 3 spots in the city of Mount Vernon. There's one on Mulberry Street, and if I need to find particulars, I can, where it looks like through plowing, we may have pulled out bricks, and it's at an intersection. Are we actively looking for spots like that to repair? Is our street department looking for brick repairs such as that? Or do they need to be called in as well?
We certainly need someone to bring it to our attention, to call.
I hope our
It
street
never hurts
department
to
is
call.
also looking for those too, because the particular spot I'm talking about, and I guess I'll drive it.
Yeah, I saw it there, Burgess Street
Is that where it was?
and Mulberry, and then the other one out at the,
So it is on the list, then we're talking a small spot now,
Right.
but we keep driving over and bricks are gonna start coming out and then plow them again, we'll just lose them in the snow. I know bricks aren't on top of everybody's list, but if we are planning on keeping them, it'd be cheaper to do it now. I also noticed we have a sunken hole at Mulberry and Chestnut in our brick around the water line. I don't know if anybody else has noticed that or not, but you could say it's dropped down, it's on the right-hand lane at Chestnut on Mulberry. So I just, if people do notice where the bricks have been pulled out of plow, I appreciate they call.
And kind of dovetail into that, and I'm sure all of you have been aware, and I'm maybe perhaps even being called, and kind of tongue-in-cheek, in all honesty with you, but where the bricks have been, and Mr. Hillier and I were talking about this earlier, where the bricks have been cut out in a square, and they have been replaced by just any kind of brick, and it is not the same type of brick it's in the street. And when Mike and I were talking about that, I kind of went around the brick streets, and there are a lot of places like that. Where, and a good example is on Vine Street going east right across the bridge, there's a whole section of brick there, it's not even the same kind of brick, it's replaced there. And so we get gigged sometimes when people say, well, the brick is rough, it's not the same, and it isn't the same. So we might want to pay a little more attention to, if we're going to keep our brick streets, and the repair that's done in the brick street is done correctly, and not just had a patch cut and then a Band-Aid placed on it. That's my 2 cents.
I think we should expand that discussion. Well, after we received the call the other day, we did go out and look at them, talk to Cameron about those are, at least as far as we can determine, not city utility dig-ups.
Correct.
So we have utility companies that are digging in the street. They were told, Mr. Keaton says, that they had to put the brick back the way they took it out. And Cameron, I don't know if you've had a chance to speak to any of the utility companies about that?
I haven't, I think they've got all the brick repairs done, but one thing that I will do is, on my to-do list, is to put together 1 or 2 page, what's acceptable repairs, and we'll make sure that no cutting of brick will take place. Basically, you have to pull them out and then piece them back together, the way that they come out.
And you are correct, Mayor, yeah, we see a lot of times if the utility lines are doing that, they will place the brick back up on the curb.
Yeah.
And
If
then
I
they
could-
usually replace that.
We discussed this a couple years ago, Mr. Glass, because we had utility companies putting in unlike material. I thought we had something already on the books with Columbia Gas that said they had to replace with like material.
Yeah, I think it's like material. I mean,
We
are
passed
we
that
talking about
years
that?
ago.
Are we talking about that situation on East Burgess Street where the square?
That
cut
is one
was?
of them, yes. And
Are
I
are
think
those
it's-
actually different brick or is it the square cut?
It looked like it's the same type of brick. I looked at it myself.
Yeah.
The only thing is that they actually just cut a square out. They didn't take the brick out like they were herringbone kind.
But I thought they had something already, according to a couple years ago, we went through this. I thought they already had something.
The problem we had before, they would put concrete or asphalt back in brick streets. And that's, they're not doing that, but now we need to take this one step farther.
Is there a penalty for it, what if they notify and they don't do it that way? But I pay $1,000 for a permit to put in driveway.
They're a public utility.
We can't ask for a,
Sure.
the same?
If you want to pass something, sure.
I think that's
Can't-
what we need to look at.
Can we make the correction and bill them for it?
If it was bad enough, yes. But typically, the public utilities are pretty responsive to come back if you've got an issue with it. A lot
Well,
of them
I
don't
think
do
they
their own
should
work
have to come
anymore.
back
They
and
hire
adhere
Right.
to our ordinance.
I think it's something, Mr. Ferry, you might want to look into. If I'm putting in a driveway, I pay $1,000 for a permit
That's right.
in order to, it's not, it's
You put up $1,000 deposit, so you put
I'm
the
sorry.
driveway in correctly. You get the
Deposit
money
or
back
permit.
when you're done. so.
and I get my $1,000 back if I did it according to the way the city gives it its blessing. So I think we might want to look at the same for utility companies. They have more money than I do.
Really?
Yeah, and I have noticed that. After we discussed this, there are a lot of places like that in Mount Vernon where the sections have been cut out. Most of the places have been replaced with same like materials. And the young woman, the woman that brought this to our attention is even further down the street from where she lives. So if you go around and look down instead of up a lot, you'll see a lot of that.
For the listening audience, when Mr. Francis and I were on the radio last week, a person called in and asked about the potholes. I gave him the number for the pothole hotline, that's 397-9501.
No, correction,
I'm so-
393.
393, I'm sorry, 393-9501. And so if people have pothole issues, that's the number to call.
Mr. Hawkins, just a couple of things about brick streets. It does not look like we have opportunity this summer to hire any extra help that we can have a brick repair crew out there. You remember a few years ago, we were able to do that. Secondly, if you recall the budget, we did not put any money in for a brick street project this year. We did the big project up there on Pleasant Street, but this year, we will be able to repair. All of you have mentioned some repairs. We need to be able to do those, but it does not look like we're going to be able to go out and have what we call a brick, I think we call it brick street repair effort that we made. And that worked while we had money to do that, but we still only have 9 people, I think, in the street department. Hot mix is available. You see a lot of potholes being patched. They are doing a lot of things out there, but I just want to tell you that that's where we are.
All right?
May I just say, just in case we did not mention it in this session, we're planning on spending about $850,000 on this resurfacing project.
And Mr. Fair, I might also mention, we have mentioned Park Street and Coshocton Avenue that are in bad condition and certainly need some of this attention.
And some of that money is coming from the state, it's not all local money. that
Yeah,
eight-
approximately 450,000.
Right, so that's important to note also. Mrs. Knoll?
Mrs. Carl?
Yes.
Mr. Hillier?
Yes.
Mr. Fair?
Yes.
Mrs. Seabolt?
Yes.
Mr. Barone?
Yes.
Mrs. Vale?
Yes.
Mr. Francis?
Yes.
Resolution is adopted. Next resolution is Resolution 2014-51. Mrs. Knoll.
Resolution number 2014-51, a resolution to grant a utility right-of-way easement upon city property to the Ohio Cumberland Gas Company and declaring an emergency.
Mrs. Carl.
I'm just going to give this a first reading tonight, Mr. President.
This resolution receives its first reading. Next resolution is Resolution 2014-52. Mrs. Knoll.
Resolution number 2014-52, a resolution to authorize the Safety Service Director to execute a supplemental right-of-way and easement upon city property to the Ohio Power Company.
Mrs. Carl.
Just a first reading for this as well.
This resolution receives its first reading. Final resolution for this evening is Resolution 2014-53. Mrs. Newell.
Resolution number 2014-53, a resolution authorizing the Safety Service Director to advertise for bids and enter into a contract for the reconstruction of Upper Gilcrest Road from Yager Road to New Gambier Road and declaring an emergency.
Mr. Fair.
Thank you, Mr. President. I'd like to ask that to suspend the rules that require three separate readings to take Resolution 2014-53 to its third and final read.
Second.
Moved and second for the suspension of the rules. Any discussion on the suspension? Mrs. Newell.
Mrs. Carl?
Yes.
Mr. Hillier?
Yes.
Mr. Fair?
Yes.
Mrs. Seabolt?
Yes.
Mr. Barone?
Yes.
Mrs. Vale?
Yes.
Mr. Francis?
Yes.
The rule is suspended. Mr. Fair.
Thank you, Mr. President. I'd like to ask for passage of Resolution number 2014-53.
Second.
Moved and second for the adoption of this resolution. Any discussion? Mr. Fair.
Thank you. We've talked about this several times. You all know where this particular piece of real estate is, Yager
yes.
Road going south down to New Gambier Road. It is really pretty in bad, it's really in bad shape. If you go left to center coming up the hill, you can get hit. The same going down the hill. So it is kind of hazardous right now. So any improvement to that, even though maybe a long-term project would be in the works down the road, this probably would save an awful lot of anguish and perhaps accidents that,
Well,
probably can be
yeah,
avoided.
And a lot of people use that.
Very highly traveled, yes.
Yes.
Mr. Fair, I think you
ma'am.
do want to mention that this is TIF district money that is being
I was
used.
going to suggest or say that the monies that are being, because it looks a little lopsided, it looks like there's pennies on the dollar of what the township or the county, whoever is paying for part of this. And our lion's share of that is six figures, but that is TIF district, which means that the property business owners on that strip are going to be paying the amount that seems a little lopsided. Did that make sense? Did I say that right?
Yes,
Correct,
that's
I said that.
absolutely correct.
Okay.
When it says here, reconstruction from Yager to Gambier, are we redoing the whole strip or just on the side of the hill where the springs are, or what is the plan?
It'll be a complete rebuild.
And does anybody want to explain why we're doing this in Monroe Township? I know, but there's some people that may not.
Well, we have a maintenance responsibility there because we traded partial roads with them 5 or 10 years ago. So this is the part that we've been responsible to maintain. I think the most important factor here is the fact that the township has come in and they've agreed to put 10% of the project in. And we are using funds from the TIF district, like John explained. Those are the people who are using this. That used to be a country road. The people who are using this road are the people who go out there and use all the businesses. Those people are taxed for this very purpose, to improve ingress and egress to their businesses, and that's really what it is.
So
Mike
even
Hillier on
though
Sugar
the-
Street is not paying for this. It's
Yeah.
the people who work out.
I
Well, maybe
understand
because you
that,
work out there,
but I was asked the very same question.
Sure.
And
I
it's,
think
you know,
that's
there's
important
other
for people
agreements
to know.
around Park Road and other areas the same way. Eastern Star, I believe, as well.
I think it's important for people to know this isn't the ultimate solution either. This is a way to make that a decent driving service for 5, 6, 7 years. That big project that we've talked about for a decade still needs to be done sometimes.
I might add to that, the agreement we have with the township ends in September of next year, I believe. At that time, we would expect the annexation up there on Upper Gilcrest Road, north of 36, that to be complete. That would become our road because we'll own on both sides of that for the most part. So this would refer back to them. Township made a case when we had this agreement set up that we did cause all the traffic. Last time we had a count, I think it was 18,000 a day or something, counting both ways on it. And they could make a case probably, so therefore the city ought to maintain the road. Well, at that time, we decided that worked out as far as maintenance procedures and schedules and that sort of thing. So we entered into that, but I think at this point, we're making our effort to put that road back in top condition, and then they'll get the road back.
Well, if I could, just since you brought up about the fact of the property being brought into the city of Mount Vernon, one of the things, and I've had a neighbor from the condo association even bring it up, with more property bringing into Mount Vernon, I don't think there's any way that it's going to be stopped. But the development can be looked at in such a manner of the number of cars that are going to be continued onto Gilcrest Road, Yager Road, New Gambia Road, Eastern Star Road, because of whatever we're gonna do once this is brought into the city of Mount Vernon. I think this really needs to be looked at, whatever the plan is that they plan on doing, because of the amount of traffic, the more traffic we're gonna put on that road.
Are you going to look at Apple Valley the same way?
It's not in the city of Mount Vernon, I don't understand what you're talking about.
Well, traffic patterns, Mike. I'm just saying that if we look at development coming up, then we have to look at the future, and Apple Valley is beginning to grow again. This particular area, I think most people know by this time, has no residents in it. This 80 acres is completely void of residents. So, but I do think that transportation is something we have to continue to work at.
I know, and the reason I bring this up, just like when we did Laurelwood, we looked at the development behind Laurelwood. It was a number of cars that it was going to put onto the street. One house brings 2 cars minimum. And I think in the plan of whatever this plan is going to be when it's brought into the city of Mount Vernon, we need to look at what's going to happen with traffic. Coshocton Avenue as well. And we can discuss it further date, I'm sure we will, but.
Well, yeah, and I think that's the kind of things, that's why we did, we put, $7 or $8 million in Coshocton Road now because we wanted to move traffic. We have a little stumbling block there at Verndale, but I think that is the reason we did that section in 2000, we did that section of Coshocton out through there to enhance business and to improve the flow of traffic. But we have to keep doing that job's never done. Job's never done.
Any other discussion? Mrs. Newell?
Mrs. Carl?
Yes.
Mr. Hillier?
Yes.
Mr. Fair?
Yes.
Mrs. Siebel?
Yes.
Mr. Barone?
Yes.
Mrs. Vale?
Yes.
Mr. Francis?
Yes.
That concludes the resolutions for this evening. We'll now move on to ordinances. We have no ordinances for third or second reading. We do have 3 for first reading, and the first one is ordinance 2014-09. Mrs. Newell?
Ordinance number 2014-09, an ordinance establishing compensation for the property maintenance enforcement officer effective June 1st, 2014, and declaring an emergency.
Mr. Francis?
Thank you, Mr. President. I recognize first reading on this ordinance and would like to call for an executive session on personnel.
Second.
Okay. This ordinance receives its first reading. Next ordinance is ordinance 2014-10. Mrs. Newell?
Ordinance number 2014-10, an ordinance authorizing the vacation of that portion of White's Ayers Street from the south line of the Coshocton Avenue right-of-way, then south to the north line of New Street right-of-way in the White's Ayers addition to the city of Mount Vernon.
Mr. Fair?
First reading, please, this evening.
This ordinance receives its first reading. Final ordinance this evening is ordinance 2014-11. Mrs. Newell?
Ordinance number 2014-11, an ordinance establishing the rate of compensation for the employee designated as the City of Mount Vernon's backup operator of record for the water and wastewater treatment plants and declaring an emergency.
Mr. Francis?
Thank you, Mr. President. I request that the rule requiring 3 separate readings be suspended and that this ordinance be taken to its third and final reading.
I second.
Been moved and second for the suspension of the rules. Any discussion on the suspension? Mrs. Newell?
Mrs. Carl?
Yes.
Mr. Hillier?
Yes.
Mr. Fair?
Yes.
Mrs. Siebel?
Yes.
Mr. Barone?
Yes.
Mrs. Vale?
Yes.
Mr. Francis?
Yes.
The rule is suspended. Mr. Francis?
Thank you, Mr. President. Request that ordinance 2014-11 be adopted.
I second.
Been moved and second for the adoption of this ordinance. Any discussion? Mr. Francis?
Thank you, Mr. President. I'm going to go to Mr. Glass, and you can explain exactly what we're doing here with this ordinance regarding Matthias Warndorf.
Well, first of all, I'd like to introduce you to Matthias. That's Matthias back there. He came in during our break, so.
But you come up here so they can see you on TV. The people at home can't see you.
Judy Scott, our treatment distribution administrator, retired effective June 1st, but she was effectively gone since the 1st of May, using up vacation and different benefit hours. And in order for us to be in compliance with the EPA's rules and regulations, we have to appoint somebody, the official operator of record for both treatment plants and the distribution and collection system. And we made that, with Judy's recommendation and mine, we made that appointment for Matt, but in order to compensate him, I am proposing to give him $6.25 an hour for this month that we're involved here. and that is equal to the difference in pay between his pay and what the prior administrator was making. I'd be happy to field any questions. If you recall from our committee meeting, it's kind of a long, drawn-out explanation if you get into all the details, but I'll certainly try.
We discussed that in committee meeting. Any other comments?
One
Mrs.
question that I think we maybe need to talk about is, will it perhaps be necessary to have a special meeting, because we won't be meeting until the end of June, and this is payable through the 5th of June. If, in fact, you have some
Mr. Orndorff and I and the EPA have
resolution to all this,
Mr. Orndorff and I and the EPA have had a lot of communications. We're trying to work out those details. If it came to a point where I can't see a situation where we would need to have a special meeting.
you can't.
I mean, you could easily write a piece of legislation to make it retroactive.
All right.
Sure.
Matthias, are you comfortable with what we're discussing? Is there anything you'd like to add to any of this?
No, sir, I want to be compensated. I'm doing, Mrs. Scott, I'm taking over the, operator of record. Plus, I'm still doing my job that I've been doing before, which is pre-treatment operator and lab technician. So I think it's more fair, and, with the extra responsibility, it should be retroactive from the time that she had taken vacation.
Well, you're one of the number of people we have employed in this community that do an outstanding job. And so anything that we can do to compensate or whatever your position or what position you would like, make sure you make us aware of it, just like you, sir.
Thank you, sir.
You're welcome.
We appreciate that you have stepped forward for this.
Thank you.
Any other discussion? Mrs. Newell?
Mrs. Carl?
Yes.
Mr. Hilliard?
Yes?
Mr. Fair?
Yes.
Mrs. Seabolt?
Yes.
Mr. Barone?
Yes.
Mrs. Vale?
Yes.
Mr. Francis?
Yes.
The ordinance is adopted. That concludes the legislative portion of the meeting. We now move on to remarks from the administration. Mayor Mavis.
Thank you, Mr. Hawkins. Yesterday, many of you were either in the parade or watching the parade, and I think Mount Vernon did itself proud. We did observe officially the Memorial Day and had the parade, which was wonderful. If you were going to make a movie about parades, that would be one you'd want to take a picture of. And the event on the square was well done. Thank you to all those that participated in that. The Chestnut Street project, see, they put the final seeds and the final straw in today, and I think, Cameron, is it officially done for the most part?
At the end of every project, we always do a punch list with the contractor. So we walk the project from end to end with the contractor, and we have not done that yet. So you may see a couple of items. I've had a couple phone calls. People are concerned about maybe some issues in their yard and that type of thing. So we'll try and catch those with a punch list, and then that should be the fun at the end of it.
So we're pretty much going to make our May 30th.
The project is complete. At this point in time, the project is substantially complete. It would just be punch list items.
And also today, Mr. Glass and I went up and met with two of the county commissioners about the fairgrounds water line. We had a project that you all are aware of. We bid, and we needed to get it done by the time Fair Week comes around. And the end result was a bid of about $102,000. Cameron's office did the design and engineering, which we think is about $12,000 worth. After talking to the commissioners, talking to Mr. Scott, we believe that we have figured out a way that the county can come up with the rest of their money. So that project hopefully will get underway and be finished and complete by Fair Week. That's all I have.
Thank you, Mayor.
Nothing, sir.
Mr. Glass. Mr. Scott. Mr. McConville.
No, thank you.
Mr. Browning.
I have nothing to add tonight.
Mr. Francis.
Just reiterate what the mayor said about the turnout for the parade. Big turnout with the veterans that come out, but I think the city's still seeking to know who the veteran population is so that we can recognize them whenever this pops up. So you can get a hold of the mayor's office or the Veterans Administration office.
You know, John, thanks for bringing that up. We did get a few of those we handed out in the parade a little registration form asking a veteran to identify himself and send it into our office for the very reason that John spoke. When we have these kind of events, we would like to be able to notify veterans. We have our World War II veterans. We did get some Korean War veterans, a couple of other ones. So we're trying to work on that identification process. So if you're a veteran and you had one of those explanation or those sheets, registration sheets, send it to us or bring it in. And if you didn't get one and you want one, if you call Mrs. Newell, she'll make sure you get one of them. But it is something the committee feels strongly about for future events. Thank you, John, for bringing that up.
Actually, I'm sorry, if I may, I have made copies and put them in the engineer's office, Streets and Parks Department, and the mayor's office, as well as it's on our website under the forms and permits link.
All right, thank you. Mrs. Vale.
Thank you, Mr. President. Well, on that note, I first would like to say thank you to our mayor and to Mr. Francis for their efforts to have a very successful Memorial Day observance for our veterans and for those families who have lost loved ones because of protecting our country. And we really appreciate your efforts, John and Mayor, for yesterday. I would like to recognize the Veterans Service Office for providing the flags and the 4th and 5th grade students from St. Vincent's Catholic School for placing these flags in Mound View Cemetery. They have done this for several years, I understand, and it was just beautiful to walk up into the cemetery when we went to plant flowers and to see all the flags. And I went to question who had done that. And Debbie told me that it was the 4th and 5th graders from St. Vincent's School. I think they deserve a lot of credit for that. Also, there are now some signs in the cemetery with information regarding cemetery rules. I would like to encourage all of our residents to read the signs and observe the rules. They're very clearly written on these signs, and all these rules are for benefit of the families whose loved ones have graves in Mound View Cemetery. Debbie Briscoe in the cemetery office will be very glad to answer any questions that anyone may have in regard to any of those rules. But we have long felt that some of these rules needed to be applied firmly, and now there are signs, and it's just really nice, I think. I'd like to thank our supervisory personnel for their annual reports. I think everyone has done a good job, and most recently Judy Cordelin. It's just really interesting to read their reports. Mr. Scott, can you talk a moment about the new bill that's in the legislature with regard to filing income tax reports? I think we need some support to get that stopped.
What I have read about it is a bill that's before the House, I think, at this time, and it is going to, if it were to carry forth, would eliminate any taxation of individuals who do not reside inside the city limits. So basically, and this of course would cover all the communities in Ohio that have an income tax in place. Only those who live here would be the people who would be taxed. The workforce, obviously, we have a significant workforce that does not live within the city limits, and this bill would exclude them from paying any income tax, is what I've been reading. So it's continuing to go through some committee works, but what I can tell you on the summarization of it is that that's what they're looking to do, is to eliminate the taxation of non-resident work staff.
Well, from what I read just today, it appears that this is going to also entail everyone having to file income tax with the city. or with all the cities, I should say. And it's going to make a lot more work for the income tax department in Mount Vernon as well as in other cities. And it's going to be a nightmare for a lot of people filing their taxes as well, if in fact they aren't doing anything wherein they need to pay city income tax.
Correct. In some regards, we already know some of that information because an employer located within the city limits would have already filed a W-2 document for that person. So we can identify it, but you're correct, in the bill, it does indicate that even those people who were non-residents would still be mandatorily required to file a tax return. I'm not sure, our ordinance currently doesn't require that. That wouldn't be any, and there'd be no reason that we would need someone to do that. The only time we normally see something like that happen is where you have an employee who is working for an employer, and part of their job is done outside of the city. I mean, maybe they're a traveling salesperson or whatever, but part of their work is done outside the city. However, their entire compensation might be subject to the withholding tax. So they'll file a tax return, even though they're a non-resident. They'll file a tax return indicating that part of my compensation was done with work not performed within the city, and we'll file a refund for that. But in this case, is what Mrs. Vale's talking about. Everybody would be required, whether you're a resident or not, to file a tax return. We have about 6,000 tax returns or so that we take in every year. I have no idea what the number would be if we had to include all the rest of these non-filers that currently aren't subject to it.
Well, it's going to affect our residents, so they should be contacting Margaret Ann and asking, or Ms. Rule, I should say, and asking that she deny the passage of this, or vote against this legislation.
Correct.
Because it affects every person in our community as well as the economics of the city, because we certainly would need to have more people employed in the income tax department.
Correct.
Anything else, Mrs. Vale?
Thank you, I'm finished, thank you.
Mr. Fair?
Nothing this evening.
Mrs. Seabold?
Thank you, President. It was so nice to pick up the paper tonight and read in the letters to the editor some nice comments about our police department. And it's two teachers from the Mount Vernon City Schools, and it talks about how the sheriff's department and the city police performed duties there that came and answered questions and just were so outstanding. And that it was so nice to have people do the jobs, that we're privileged to live with our people that are enforcing the law, the policemen and everything, and they're our friends, not only a police officer. So if you get time, read the letters to the editor tonight. It's nice, and congratulations to the police department. That's all, thank you.
Mrs. Carl?
Nothing this evening.
Mr. Hilliard?
Thank you. I have just one item. I'd like to touch on something we've talked about before, and that's passing legislation on an emergency basis. I've talked to our city law director earlier today. There's a couple pieces of legislation I feel that we had on tonight's agenda that we're passing on wanted to pass on an emergency basis. Both of them have been in the works for a long time. I don't think I need to mention them point blank right now unless you want me to, but I don't feel it's fair to council. I don't feel it's fair to the people of Mount Vernon. I think we saw a little bit of what happens tonight in committee meetings when we are asked to do such a thing. I think when we have something in such a long-term plan as the two items I'm speaking of, that we should be able to have more time. That we should, and I'll just say it's the maintenance enforcement officer wage. It's also the Cumberland gas easement. We've talked about that gas project for over a year. The building's been tore down for a long time. And I think we probably knew this was coming, but to be asked to pass it tonight, I don't feel it's fair. And I just appreciate if we have more time in the future. I think we were cautioned earlier about passing emergency legislation when it's not necessary, what legislation should be and what shouldn't be passed on an emergency basis. So I just feel that we need to be very careful in the future on what we're asked to pass as emergency. Thank you.
Thank you. I'd like to mention that the resident of our community, Melanie Bollender, was appointed Friday by the governor to the State Board of Education. And I think that's quite a kudos for our community, and especially for Melanie for being appointed to that position. Melanie, of course, works at the Eastern Star Home, is also very active in the Ariel Foundation Park, very active in the Chamber of Commerce, a very active person in this community. I think she'll serve us well on the State Board of Education. We mentioned the parade yesterday. It was excellent. I would like to, Patty Coates is a teacher in Mount Vernon, is going to be retiring this year. And one thing she did for veterans, I know at Columbia School, they made over 400 brochures for veterans thanking them for their services, and that was passed out to the people. Actually, the South Vernon Church scored those, and certain students received awards for that. She also did that at Twin Oaks. I think that was a nice thing to share with our veterans and to show our appreciation from our youngsters at our elementary schools. The first Saturday of June will be June 7th, and at 8:30 at SIPS, there'll be some council members there. If people in the community would like to come and discuss city issues. We're now going to have a motion to go into executive session. There will be no further action other than adjournment after the executive session. I'll call on Mr. Francis for a motion.
Thank you, Mr. President. I move to go into executive session regarding personnel, wages, and land acquisition.
I second.
And moved and seconded to go into executive session. We need to call the roll. Mrs. Knoll.
Mrs. Carl?
Yes.
Mr. Hillier?
Yes?
Mr. Fair?
Yes.
Mrs. Siebel?
Yes.
Mr. Barone?
Yes.
Mrs. Vale?
Yes.
Mr. Francis?
Yes.
We are in executive session.